I'm Chandra Linton in my everyday life. I'm a tax attorney here at Dorsey, but for the next half hour or so, Mike and I will be walking you through an overview of election law, both federal and state, mostly state. This is intended just to be an overview, and if any of you have anything to contribute, either from your knowledge of the law or from your experiences out in the field or at the hotline in the past. I know several of you have volunteered with us in 2008 and may have done this before for other organizations. Then please feel free to chime in and we can make it a more interactive discussion. The first thing here is the federal laws, and I'll just go through this briefly because most of what we deal with will be state law driven. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 has been called the most important voting rights legislation. It was intended as an anti-discrimination piece of legislation, and for example, it had a prohibition on the use of literacy tests, and it has some special enforcement provisions with respect to areas that have historically disenfranchised voters that are not applicable to Minnesota, but that's one of the things that it's well known for. It does have an anti-intimidation provision in section 11B and provides for voter assistance due to disability or inability to read or write in section 208. And we'll go, that one is actually a Minnesota law as well, and so we'll go through that in a little bit more detail later. The National Voter Registration Act of 1993 was intended to make registration easier for voters. It includes this motor voter provision where voters are able to register if they register for a driver's license. They're required to be allowed the opportunity to register to vote at the same time. Help America Vote Act of 2002, also known as HAVA, was in reaction to some of the problems that we saw in 2000 and included the language regarding provisional ballots, which we don't have in Minnesota because we have same-day election registration. It also eliminated punch card machines and had some provisions regarding the accessibility of voting machines. These last two, the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of 1984 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, also have some specific provisions relating to voting accessibility. So we're going to go through a number of different areas of election law that are state law as opposed to federal, and I'll just get started, but these are the different areas. Problems Minnesota historically has not had that you may have seen in the news with respect to other states are problems relating to mass challenges of voters. Provisional ballots, like I said, we don't have because we have same-day registration, and we do have a law that prohibits deceptive practices, although that may not always be followed, but we historically haven't had a lot of problems with that. I'm going to start with voter registration here. There's a lot of issues that come up with this on election day. They're not necessarily big problems, but we do get a lot of questions about where voters are required to vote, whether they're properly registered, what kind of information they need to provide in order to register. So we're going to go through this in some detail. Minnesota law provides that you may pre-register to vote anytime up to 20 days before the election, or if you're not pre-registered, then you may register to vote on election day. So there's just a window in there where they don't take registration. But if you're registering, or you're voting by absentee ballot, you can register at the same time you cast your absentee ballot. Voters who are already registered, who are pre-registered, don't have to provide photo identification on election day. They simply have to sign the roster, state that they're properly registered, and that they haven't already voted. The election judge can ask for confirmation of address or date of birth just to verify that it's the right person, but no ID is required. So that's really important to remember that in general, if you're pre-registered, no photo ID is required on election day. So, to be eligible to vote, so to be eligible to register, an individual must meet these criteria. They must be a U.S. citizen, be at least 18 years old on or before election day, and have resided in Minnesota for 20 days immediately preceding the election. they're not eligible to vote if they've been convicted of a felony and their civil rights have not been restored, and there's some nuances to this that I'll go into in just a minute. If they are under guardianship in which the court order, there's actually a court order revoking the individual's right to vote. So just because they're under guardianship doesn't mean that they can't vote. There has to actually be a specific court order noting that they can't vote. And again, they have been found by a court to be legally incompetent. Again, this means the court has to say they're legally incompetent. If a voter hasn't voted for 4 years or more, they must re-register to be eligible to vote, but it doesn't mean that they can't vote. They simply have to re-register. So as far as felony disenfranchisement, there's a lot, this is in the news a lot, and people have a lot of misconceptions about whether or not felons can vote. The rule in Minnesota is that a person who's been convicted of a felony and is incarcerated or on parole or probation for a felony conviction may not vote. But as soon as the sentence has been fully discharged, their civil right to vote is automatically restored. So when they get out of prison, they're not automatically restored. They have to be off of probation and for parole, but as soon as they're done with that, they can vote. And again, a lot of the problems that arise here are about lack of information, but as long as they're not currently under sentence, felons may vote.
Do you have a question?
If someone is on probation but has a stay of adjudication pending completion of probation,
I
can they vote?
haven't
Yeah,
run into
I don't
that
think
before,
so.
but I don't think so.
I think the term is off paper, and I think that they would still be considered on paper even if there's a stay of adjudication because they're still on probation.
Any other questions?